This is our fourth week of class and our overview of decision making. Decision making is a very, very interesting topic to me, and I do think that a lot of what's in your book is somewhat out of date. I'll review some of the key concepts associated with the book coverage, just because you may be expected to know it in some of your other classes, but I have supplemented with a lot of information about bias and uncertainty in decision making. I also have that video for you that I want to make sure that you watch by Dan Ariely. It's a really, really good video that illustrates some of the current thinking in behavioral economics about decision making. So by the end of this module, what I want you to be sure you understand is these concepts from the chapter about programmed and non-programmed decisions, and be able to explain what non-programmed decisions are in terms of complexity and uncertainty. I'm also interested in making sure you understand the idea of bias and some examples of bias and how biases arise in decision making. And then finally, I'm interested in having you understand the idea of uncertainty, and uncertainty not just as sort of a simplistic idea, in the lay use of the term, but also in a richer, more complex way that helps really dig into the sources of the uncertainty. So let's start out with a brief overview of some of the ideas first introduced at the beginning of your chapter. Certainly managers make decisions all day. They make decisions that are, in some cases, they seem inconsequential, they may seem routine, but the essence of decision making is that the pattern of decisions that you make over time, those patterns generally begin to reveal themselves as having some common themes to them. They tend to accumulate over time and have consequences. So an example of that, sort of a tactical or operational, seemingly inconsequential at the time decision, might be how a particular retail establishment handles returns from customers. And so it could be that in how they interact with customers during a return is something that they care a little bit about, but they aren't really working all that hard to improve that process. And so over time, maybe the supervisors and the managers tend to resist approving returns or resist approving a full reimbursement for a return. And so over time, that accumulates, and over time, it begins to have the weight of policy. It begins to look like this particular establishment is not willing to give full returns. And so it seems like a one-off decision when it's made, and then someone else sees a manager do it, and someone else copies that, thinks that's the way they're supposed to do it, and pretty soon it becomes institutionalized, a way of doing business there that again has the weight of policy, and it's sort of taught as the way they do things, even if it was not intended. So it's just extraordinarily important to recognize that patterns of inconsequential decisions have the weight of policy over time. Other decisions are the ones that we would all agree are strategic, big picture decisions, large amounts of money, long-term consequences, often something that might be moving into a new market, introducing a new product. And so it's a decision being made now, or a series of decisions being made now that have consequences in the long term, and they generally are characterized by a high level of uncertainty. The reason they're characterized by uncertainty is they're talking about making an investment for something a couple of years out. And so if, for example, a company decides they're going to build a plant in a particular community, a new manufacturing plant in a particular community, they are doing that building on some assumptions about what labor availability will be there, what labor qualifications they can find in that community. They're making assumptions about population and transportation and taxes and all sorts of things that play into location decisions. But given the amount of time it takes to build a new plant, it could be years before they have their facility there. So they're placing a bet, so to speak, that the labor conditions, the labor price, the labor quality, labor availability, and all the other characteristics of the community will be what they are supposing they will be at the time of the decision. So patterns of decisions generally will reflect values, sort of the understanding of what the company values and its policies, organizational culture, but they also include uncertainty and bias. The classical model of decision making that is described in your book is sort of the way people were taught 30, 40, 50 years ago and longer to make decisions. And it was a process, a very linear process of assuming that the decision maker could identify and evaluate all possible alternatives, and that the consequences were understood, and that the decision maker could then choose the most appropriate course of action. And so the logic of that classical model is sort of, if you make a bad decision, it's because you didn't collect enough information and didn't frame it properly in order to make the proper decision. So these are the 6 steps in that classical model. Many of you will recognize this as possibly how you were taught about planning or strategic planning when you were in high school, possibly in an undergrad, a high school class of some kind. But it's the idea of recognizing the need for a decision, which, sometimes that's the biggest problem. Generate alternatives, and of course the ability to generate all possible and best alternatives can be a real challenge in real life. Assess the alternatives, choose among them, implement, and then learn from the feedback. And of course, we would all recognize that's a very simplistic approach to decision making. Decisions can be programmed or non-programmed, and programmed decisions are those that tend to be routine and somewhat automatic, and they follow established rules, guidelines, and policies. Managers generally will have made that decision before. They have experience in making the decision, and there are rules or guidelines that they follow, and there's relatively little ambiguity involved. An example might be when a company has decided it's going to administer its raises for the next year, and they've awarded a department a certain amount of money for a raise pool. Well, there will typically be within a company sort of conventions or norms for how they distribute that money. And so, it could be that everybody is given a percent of the raise pool. They could be given the same percentage. It could be that the percentage is a function of sort of performance evaluations. But whatever that process is, there will in all probability be a process that is outlined for how they will distribute that money. So each manager is not winging it and deciding what process they're going to follow. There'll be guidelines that come either from HR or that come from established norms among the management team. There's also non-programmed decisions, and these are the ones where there's a fair amount of uncertainty involved, where it's a one-off or unique or possibly ambiguous circumstance associated with the decision. And this would be, like a new product launch. I would love to think that new products are launched with full understanding of the marketplace and full understanding of customer reaction to the new product and full understanding of how much it's going to cost to produce it and the reliability of the network of suppliers that support it. But the reality is there's a lot of uncertainty associated with all of that, a lot of ambiguity associated with it. New site expansions, the decision to expand capacity can be fraught with uncertainty and problematic, because you don't really know what your competitors are going to do. So if you expand capacity and it ends up your competitor is expanding capacity at the same time, you could end up with excess capacity in the industry that undermines the performance of both companies. So again, they're non-programmed, meaning they don't happen very often, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with them. And finally, a crisis or any kind of ethical issue is something that generally will be a surprise to an organization. Okay, let's talk briefly about three concepts. One is intuition, the other is reasoned judgment, and the other is bounded rationality. So intuition is this idea of feelings, beliefs, and hunches, whatever would come readily to your mind. And a lot of people will argue that this is how they make decisions. They'll say they just go with their gut. Well, what go with your gut means is that you are basically making the decision based on what has worked for you in the past. You're sort of keying on the information that you've keyed on in the past, and you're saying, well, this looks a lot like what I've seen happen in the past, and so you go with it. Well, that can be very effective. That idea of sort of pattern recognition, this situation is similar to that situation, can be spot on, accurate. It could be that gives you a really good outcome, but it could also be that through force of habit, you saw what you were looking for, right? You saw what you were looking for, and as a consequence, it looks like it's an analogous or similar or identical situation, when in reality it's not. So gut approaches tend to make a lot of sense when they work, and also are catastrophic when they don't. And so most people would argue, check your intuition. You don't want to make decisions that defy all of your past experience and logic, but you also don't want to be cavalier and assume everything is like what you've done in the past. So intuition can cause you to jump to conclusions, oversimplify, and create a lot of other problems. Bounded rationality is a term that is used by economists quite often, and it is actually a concept, an idea that was recognized with the Nobel Prize several decades ago. But the idea here is that people have limitations in their ability to interpret, process, and act on information. You only have so much bandwidth, and so the number of alternatives that you can consider at any given time is somewhat limited, and it's hard for you to wrap your mind around too much complexity. So if there are too many different variables at play, if there are too many different alternatives at play, that amount of information can be so vast and so overwhelming that what people will do is they will try to simplify. They'll try to develop heuristics or rules of thumb to help them think through the complexity of the situation. And sometimes it causes them to just shut down. Although some of this research has been disputed, there has been some research to show that the proliferation of brands at retail has actually resulted in people hesitating and not buying rather than embracing this broad choice like you might expect. So an example of that might be if you go to the grocery store. It used to be 30 years ago that if you walked in to buy jams or jellies in the grocery store, it would for the most part be 2 or 3 companies offering 3 or 4 varieties each. So you'd be strawberry, grape, maybe a couple of others, be Smucker's and somebody else, and it just wasn't an overwhelming comprehensive choice. Well, now, there's inventory management practices and supply chain practices are so much more sophisticated that they're able to offer at any grocery store so much more variety than they once did, because they don't have to keep the depth of inventory of any one item like they once did. And so they can make maximum use of their shelf space. And the choices are just overwhelming. And some research has shown that frustration with not being able to process all of that and just being overwhelmed by choice causes some people to just kind of shut down and walk away. They don't even buy any, even though they have more choices than ever in the history of the world to buy from. Reasoned judgment is the idea of careful information gathering, generation of alternatives, and evaluation of alternatives. And so that's more of what we think of as kind of a scientific approach to decision making. The idea that you structure your information gathering, you hypothesize what you might need, you collect information based on your hypothesis of what you might need, and you evaluate it objectively. So that idea of reasoned judgment is more typical of a kind of a scientific approach to making decisions. So why do we care about this idea of reasoned judgment or objectivity and structured objectivity? Why is it important? Well, in any business organization, the reason why you want to collect all the facts before you make decisions and weigh them appropriately is because it removes the perception of politics and favors from decision making. I mean, if you're always going with your gut, or you're always waiting for what your vice president of marketing has to say, or going with what a lead customer has to say, then it really looks like you're led by the personality or the individual rather than the facts, objective facts associated with the decision that needs to be made. And so if you can force yourself to try to systematically review facts, then it can definitely improve the quality of decision making. And importantly, that idea of just not letting personality and politics get into things, but to instead establish as the baseline for the business that you're part of that a search for truth, sort of irrespective of whose toes it might step on, that search for truth is an important part of culture. What interferes with this search for truth, search for facts? Well, one thing is, as I've sort of alluded to before, is the idea of overconfidence and biases. The idea of going with your gut and your intuition because you've been successful with that approach in the past. And as I've mentioned several times, that works great as long as the circumstances haven't changed. But if you're jumping to the conclusion that everything is just like it used to be, it can mean you ignore evidence that times are changing. There's also hearsay and filters. And so it's the idea that in a lot of business organizations, some of you who work in industry will know exactly what I'm talking about. There's some people who like to work the hall, right? They're always up, moving around, talking to everybody. They're always trying to get a word in and cultivate sort of a relationship with the superiors in the organization, the bosses. And when they do that, they are engaging in conversations and gathering information and passing on information. And if that is accurate information, great. But it could also be that it's just sort of their word, their interpretation. And so they are passing on sort of hearsay. And they become, in some ways, a little bit of a filter because they're putting themselves out there as the spokesperson for the group. And they begin to influence the way people hear things and interpret things, and it can be problematic. Another problem that is very common in businesses is what we think of as casual benchmarking. And that's this idea of really just relying on superficial information. Casual benchmarking says, well, we know our key competitor has invested in a particular new technology. And without even understanding what that technology means or what capability might undergird the development of that new technology, they jump out to try to buy somebody who has that same technology. And that may be very casual benchmarking. It could be that now that they have that technology, first off, it doesn't mean they have the capability that the other firm had. It can be a form of superficial analysis. Another thing that can happen is the idea of reliance on superstars. This can happen a lot where, maybe you have a top researcher who was at the top of their game, and they now have so much, people have so much respect for them, and they carry such a weighty reputation that anything they say goes, even though they may not be expert in the new areas that are important to the company. And you have to really worry about that. I have seen examples of that with Nobel Prize winners, where Nobel Prize winners, once they're recognized with a Nobel Prize, they are definitely recognized for being an authority on a particular topic. But sometimes they use their popularity and their recognition as a Nobel Prize winner to then go and take positions on things where they don't have any unique knowledge or unique authority, and yet people tend to listen to them. They think of them as a superstar. They must know everything. An analogy in business would be if, for example, you have a superstar salesperson who is the number one salesperson in the company year after year after year. But they would not necessarily be the one who is most expert at talking about what those customers might want 5 years from now. They may be expert at closing a sale now, but not necessarily expert at pulling in understanding trend data and the sort of the direction of the company that is your customer 5 years from now. Somebody else might have more insight into that. So there are other examples here, half-truths that no longer apply or don't apply in every case. And again, that's sort of this conventional wisdom idea. Institutional wisdom that is not articulated or no longer accurate. Again, it's just the idea that what you think is true may not be true. What you think are the facts may not be the facts. They may be some of the facts, but not all of the facts. And then, of course, another thing that interferes with facts is just uncertainty, the inability to know the facts. So let's give now some examples of specific types of biases. Some of these are reflected in the readings for this week, the supplemental readings for this week. One of the forms of bias is the idea of expectations, that expectations can condition our interpretation of facts. And so, for example, there are a lot of examples of situations, for example, in the venture capital community, where, if a venture capital firm makes $1 million investment in a company because they believe they're going to double their sales in the next year, and they believe that, well, then if they only, if they almost reach a doubling of their sales, but not quite, then in their view, their expectation was it would be higher, so it has not met their expectation. And so that colors their interpretation of those facts. In that case, it would mean to them, this was not evidence of success. This was evidence of failure to meet the goal. Whereas somebody else who doesn't have that, expectation that they're going to double their sales would see an increase of 80%, say, as fantastic performance. And so one would look at it as high, tremendous evidence of success. Another would view it as falling short of the goal, and all because they're interpreting those facts differently. Another form of bias is the idea of anchoring, meaning disproportionate weight to the first information received. If we were meeting in a classroom right now, I would conduct an experiment with you. I've done it in tremendous number of classes, even quite small classes. And so I would divide the classroom into half. In one half of the room, I would give a piece of paper with 2 statements on it. For the first half of the room, the statement would be, is the population of Turkey 20 million? And the next sentence would be, give me your best estimate of the population of Turkey. Okay? Now the other half of the class, and no one knows what the other half is getting, the other half of the class would be given 2 questions. The first question would be, is the population of Turkey 100 million? And then the next question would be, what is your best estimate of the population of Turkey? Okay, so keep in mind what we're doing here. So one side of the room has received a prompt that is asking, is the population 20, 25 million, whatever I use, and then asking for an estimate. The other is given 100 million and then asked for an estimate. Well, as you might expect, because of the human inclination to anchor, even though nobody actually knows the population of Turkey. Let me just go ahead and stipulate that. I mean, all the classes I've done this with, no one actually knew the population of Turkey. But the people who are presented with that 20-something million prompt will estimate something in and around 20 to 50 million on average. I'll sum up the average. I'm going to take the average of all of the responses. And then for the ones that are given the 100 million prompt, I will average those, and theirs will be 100 to say 120 million as the average. And so everyone is using that information that was presented to them as a reference point, a form of anchoring the first information. It influenced what they did after that. Another form of bias is inadvertently selecting only the facts or alternatives that reinforce what is already known, and that's status quo bias. That is part of what is the bias with intuition, right? Because you're selecting, you tend to, whether you realize it or not, only look for the facts and evidence that reinforce your previous experience. It's what you already know, what you've done in the past. And again, if the status quo is identical to what it was in the past, you know, I mean, if all of those two situations line up, great. But the reality is they are unlikely to line up. A fourth that I'm sure you've heard of is called escalating commitment, and it's allowing sunk costs to frame the situation. Sunk costs are costs that can't be recovered. So for example, if we were building a new manufacturing plant, and we have, say, estimated that the market for this new manufacturing plant is $350 million in revenue per year once the plant is up. And then after we're, you know, halfway through the construction and millions of dollars have been spent, we find out that the product we were going to produce there is not going to be cleared by the FDA, or the product that we were going to produce there is never going to be cost effective enough to sell 350 million because of some raw material that is no longer available. If we then at that point continue to build the plant and argue that we've got to make it work, and build the, you know, spend the rest of the money and build the plant and start producing something that you're never going to be able to sell, you're going to end up losing a whole lot more money than if you had just pulled the plug and walked away. Now, some companies can turn a situation like that around. Well, what that means is that there was some additional information that was brought to bear. But you don't want just the fact that you've invested a lot of money already to cause you to throw good money after bad. That's the lay expression for that, throwing good money after bad. Confirming evidence, again, is keying on evidence that supports what we want. And I choose a phrase from a movie I saw years ago. I can't remember the movie. I just remember the phrase because I immediately wrote it down. And it was, the problem with hunches is all you see after that is evidence that confirms the hunch. And that, again, is a little bit of what we talked about with the status quo example. And then there is this problem of confusing association and causality. So people often just read way too much into random associations, and they think that just because two things are correlated with each other and moving in sync with each other, that one causes the other. But as you know, anyone who studied math and science to any degree or just has common sense about this knows that often there is a third factor, something that could be causing both of those that you haven't identified at all. But that is a common thing. And my biggest concern with it is that often journalists, you know, our news media does not do a good job at all of teasing out the difference between association and causality. And it's just something we all have to live with. We all need to be more attuned and attentive to that dilemma. And then finally, overconfidence, and that is just, it's difficult to refute early conclusions. People are embarrassed if they have to change their mind, and so they tend to get entrenched and protect their position rather than allow new information to penetrate their shields. So this is the end of the first part of this Class 4 decision-making discussion, and as you see here, we have covered thus far some of those distinctions between programmed and non-programmed decisions and some examples of those. And we've also talked about patterns of bias in decision making. And our objective is to cover uncertainty more specifically in the next video. Thank you.